This is a republic, if you can keep it, with Mark Brewer and Jeff Timmer.
I'm Mark Brewer. Welcome to the McCarthyism 2.0 episode of A Republic, if you can keep it. The Republican game plan for the 2026 campaign is clear. Democrats are soft on crime communists. Using Hollywood terms, it's a sequel to what was, for a while, the highly successful 1950s crusade led by that demagogue, Wisconsin Senator Joe McCarthy.
Under their system, the individual was nothing, the family was nothing, God did not even exist. Their theory was that an all-powerful state should have the power of life or death over its citizens without even a trial, that everything and everybody belonged to the rulers of the state.
Communism is a mortal threat to American liberty. Communism is the exact opposite of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's death, tyranny, and the pursuit of evil. The godless communist morality states that anything is justified to bring about inhuman visions and to really propose what's good. They don't want good. They don't love God, and they don't want God. They don't love religion, and they don't want religion, and they won't have it. But we will not let them win. They have no chance against us.
I'm Jeff Timmer. The candidates in Michigan's two very high-profile primary battles had TV debates in the last few days. Did the debates change anything in the races for the GOP nomination for governor or the Dem nomination for U.S. Senate? Hint, I don't think they did, not even a little bit.
I'm with Jeff on that analysis of the debates, but we'll talk more about that. Donald Trump got a diplomatic red card for his unhinged performance at the meeting of NATO leaders, threatening again to invade Greenland, insulting our allies while praising the Turkish dictator who hosted the meetings and who has been sanctioned for his cozy military relationship with Putin's Russia.
Trump's Justice Department is ramping up threats to disrupt and discredit the 2026 election, targeting 3 Democratic strongholds in Michigan. We'll be joined later in the podcast by former DOJ voting rights attorney Sam Bagenstos.
And the Graham Plattner story out of Maine has reached the inevitable conclusion in the wake of allegations he raped a former girlfriend, with Plattner defiant, but recognizing that his support had evaporated. And it's a classic example of what happens when you don't vet your candidates.
This is incredibly difficult because I know that some will think it's an admission of guilt, and it most certainly is not. We're not doing it because of the allegations. We're doing it because of the structures that are being taken away from us by those in power.
And a $5 million judgment with a finding that Donald Trump sexually assaulted and then defamed E. Jean Carroll earlier this week. A fed-up federal judge ordered the release of the escrowed $5.8 million in one of the defamation cases brought by columnist E. Jean Carroll related to Trump's sexual assault against her, saying that Trump stalling was over. Still pending another $83 million plus interest judgment in another defamation case related to Trump's sexual assault of Carroll. No word yet from the other 27 women who've credibly described Trump's sexual crimes against them.
Let's get into the 2 big primaries on the ballot in August: the Democratic tussle for the U.S. Senate nomination and the Republican knife fight for the gubernatorial nomination. Since our last podcast, State Senator Mallory McMorrow, although running a terrific campaign, did not see the traction she needed and suspended her campaign, leaving that as a 2-person race between Haley Stevens and Abdul El-Sayed, although McMorrow's name will remain on the ballot. And the rumors of a Perry Johnson-Mike Cox teaming up to deny the nomination to John James have not yet materialized. We'll discuss what this means for the Republicans and then turn our attention to the Stevens-El-Sayed battle. We might even have time to look at other primary battles. But, Jeff, what's your take on these primary developments this week?
Well, looking at the Republican nomination for governor, we've talked about this in the last couple of episodes since Trump made his choice of John James, how it might not be a done deal. The golden touch that Trump has displayed in previous years in Republican primaries for a lot of reasons. One, because of Trump's historic unpopularity and growing unpopularity, even with a segment of the Republicans, as evident in some of these primary battles for governor that his nominee has, or his choice of nominee has lost. Iowa, in South Carolina, and in Georgia. But also because when Trump picks a nominee, that usually means that the money flowing to any opposing candidate is cut off, that funders and outside groups don't want to put money up against Trump because it's usually a losing bet in a Republican primary. But with a self-funder like Perry Johnson, it doesn't have that impact. So he's been spending away tens of millions of dollars. Mike Cox has been spending a good chunk of money now, taking, just layers of hide off of John James with, taking money from the MEDC, outsourcing jobs, do all kinds of MAGA sins, taking positions that would be sins to MAGA voters. There was a poll this week that showed that the John James, it was an internal poll pushed out by them, by the James campaign, showing him with a 20-some point lead over Perry Johnson and an even larger one over Mike Cox. It doesn't square with the fact that John James got onto the debate stage for the first time after having avoided this any kind of joint appearance tussle with Perry Johnson, with Mike Cox. If he really had a 20-plus point lead, the only thing that can come out of a debate for John James would be he screws up and says something so stupid, egregious, such a gaffe that it gives an opportunity to one of the other candidates or both of the candidates to pounce. They usually don't help a candidate. They typically only hurt a candidate. And so, or they don't make any difference. And I think the way that debate went last night didn't change anything. People don't watch. People pay attention to a presidential debate. They don't pay attention, and they only pay a little bit of attention to that. And you can look at the history of presidential debates and, maybe come up with a handful of instances where they've ever made a difference. Donald Trump in 2024 never debated his Republican opponents. Didn't stop him, didn't hurt him. There was no penalty. Voters didn't care. That's how, if John James was truly large and in charge and just stopping to this nomination in August, I think John James would not have shown up at this debate, would have, just kept his doing what he's been doing. But they felt that they needed to do something different. And so that tells me that they're hearing the footsteps behind them, those footsteps of the tens of millions of dollars of attacks that have come their way. And there's still nearly 4 weeks for a lot more fire to come in. Heavy artillery is going to be coming John James's way. It's going to be very curious to see if James or his big spending allies with his super PAC or others, the Republican Governors Association, any Trump-affiliated group, if they take heavy artillery and shoot it in the direction of Perry Johnson and or Mike Cox. I still believe, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago and last week, the rumors about Perry Johnson and Mike Cox teaming up to consolidate whatever anti-James sentiment might be out there is, I think, essential to stopping James at this point. Could Perry Johnson or Mike Cox win a three-way battle against James? Yes. I mean, the possibility is there. The probability would be very low. And if both Cox and Perry Johnson stay in the race, I think that does increase the likelihood and the probability that John James does come out of this. If and conceivably it would be Mike Cox, who is polling third in most of the polls that have been public in this race over the last several months. And despite his own deep pockets, they're nowhere near as deep as Perry Johnson, who's now spent, something like $70 or $80 million in the last 4 years and has yet to ever receive one single vote. And he didn't make the ballot in 2022. He never faced primary voters in his, quixotic run for the GOP nomination for president that really ended in 2023. And then this year he has yet to, well, I guess there are some votes probably sitting in absentee ballots in clerk's offices around the state, but no one has officially counted or registered a vote for Perry Johnson yet. I could see a Johnson Cox ticket that I joked about last week. And that's the only way I think they stop John James at this point. Otherwise, John James probably comes through as the victor on August 4th, though he's going to be very damaged by other Republicans, Mike Cox and Perry Johnson. And this is a year where he starts off in a very deep hole against Jocelyn Benson on August 4th, even if no one ever laid a glove on him during the primary. And if these guys continue to lob the artillery at him to the tune of millions of dollars of negative advertising, it's only going to dig that hole deeper.
Yeah, thanks for all that, Jeff. Very insightful as usual. Let me just add a few things, and then we can turn our attention to the Democratic senatorial primary. On debates, I agree with you. It's very rare that a debate has an impact. I mean, most recently, obviously, Biden's terrible performance in the opening debate in 24 led to him getting out of the race. I also recall Barack Obama's poor performance back at the 2012 first debate, but he upped his game. He upped his game in the subsequent debates, and that ended up fine for the Democrats. But that's the kind of thing you worry about when candidates come into that debate setting. I wish that debates could be more impactful, more meaningful. You could get a good exchange between candidates, particularly if there's only 2 or 3 of them over the course of an hour and a half. But for a variety of reasons now, audiences are so divided out there. Attention is divided. People are so locked into their candidates. There's so many other ways that people can campaign and reach voters. They just don't have the impact that they used to have. I mean, pundits still love them. Reporters still love them. These TV and radio stations, Jeff, fight to sponsor these debates. Maybe they're good for their ratings for one night, or they're good for the reporter's reputation. But we're long past the days where they really had any significant impact, any impact at all, frankly, on these races, unless a candidate makes a major error. So we'll have to see. There's still more debates to come. Maybe somebody will make a mistake. But other than that, I think these other means of reaching voters and will decide these races. On that race, Jeff, there still continues to be a lot of Republican grassroots grumbling about James, right? He doesn't get out. We don't see the guy. He's taken us for granted. I think you're right. I mean, I was surprised myself that he showed up, because he's been a no-show in every other debate that's been set up. And he seems to think, was acting as if he was the far and away presumed front runner. Why should he engage with folks? I mean, he turned the Mackinac Island situation into a debacle, and then attempted to get a debate with Jocelyn Benson, which he wisely declined. But again, he was acting like the front runner, and it just didn't play out. So yeah, I think there is something going on there. They're nervous about the grassroots. They're nervous about the amount of money that can still get spent. Maybe the Trump endorsement didn't have the impact they thought it was going to be. But in any event, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And you're absolutely right about the money. Cox and Johnson have the resources to stay in this thing, particularly Johnson. and he's spent a lot of money. And I think you're right. You mentioned that we're on our way to a $100 million Republican gubernatorial primary. But apropos of that, I think we're also on the way to a $100 million Democratic Senate primary. You've already seen significant spending by AIPAC, for example, and its allies. I expect that will continue as they attack Abdul El-Sayed. Obviously, El-Sayed's got, I think, his father-in-law's super PAC, and there are other groups that are coming to his defense. And there's other groups, that could potentially get involved, the pharmaceutical industry, the AI industry. I mean, we both know they've got significant resources. AI leaders around the country have been bragging about their huge war chest. Do they get involved in this primary over the next month? So I think we're headed to, it could be it's going to be a very ugly month in both of these races. And I think it's just going to get worse over the course of the next month. And we'll just have to see how it all plays out. There was a lot of interest this week. I actually did a couple of interviews with media telling people how they could spoil their absentee ballots, because obviously people had already cast ballots and had sent them in, or they're sitting on their kitchen table. And so people are now obviously thinking about changing their votes, not wanting to waste a vote on a candidate who suspended her campaign. So that dynamic is going to play out over the next several weeks, keeping our clerks here in Michigan. I was asked by a reporter this week, has this kind of thing ever happened? I said, look, candidates suspend their campaigns, but not at this level. I can't recall a major statewide race where this happened a month before the primary. So it's a big deal in terms of being able to, people go and spoil their AD ballots. There are plenty of mechanisms to do that so people don't waste their votes. But we're going to see now a real mad scramble and a vicious fight over the supporters of Mallory McMorrow between these two candidates. And there's some more debates coming up. I think we're going to see the same ugliness we saw this week in those debates, which frankly aren't very enlightening to the viewers. And I think just add to the negativity of the race. And I worry, like, you don't worry about it, Jeff, but you mentioned it, that whoever emerges from this primary is going to be damaged because of this Democratic cannibalism, this Democratic infighting. It's gotten very personal, very ugly. Particularly if you look at what people are saying online about these candidates, each other. There's just no place for this in politics, but it's where we are. It's what Trump has done to American politics. And sadly, a lot of people on both sides of the aisle have followed him down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I want to mention a couple things here. And first, I want to start with the McMorrow campaign. And I didn't have a dog in this fight. I hadn't come out publicly in favor of any of the candidates, as what I think matters, to voters. It certainly doesn't. But I thought that McMorrow's lane was dependent upon a heavy artillery battle with each side going scorched earth negative against one another, El-Sayed and Haley Stevens, while the McMorrow had enough resources to just kind of run right around that train wreck. Because I used the analogy several times. I'll say it one more time. In 2010, when the Republican nomination for governor with Mike Cox and Pete Hoekstra, they were just duking it out on the airwaves from about Memorial Day onward. And Rick Snyder had enough of his own self-funding. He just ran his own race, had his own conversation while these two were fighting it out. And the undecideds said, I don't like either of these two guys. I hear lots of bad things about him. I'm going to Rick Snyder because no one says anything bad about him. That was the path for Mallory McMorrow. And I think it's happening now, the artillery battle between Stevens and El-Sayed, but it didn't happen early enough for McMorrow to get the traction that she needed. And her staying in the race, there was just an exercise in futility, given the fact, and this is another thing I want to mention, the way that the insular crowd in Washington, Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority PAC, and allies look at this race. I think they made a strategic miscalculation that Haley Stevens was the best candidate they needed to get behind because she's in Congress. They should have made an effort to clear the race like they did, like was done with Alyssa Slotkin after Debbie Stabenow retired. The strength of Alyssa Slotkin as a candidate, coupled with the strong message from leadership in Washington that we need to have one candidate and win this race. When that failed, they should have stayed out of it or pressured Haley to get out of it, because Mallory McMorrow was a much better candidate to bring this infighting within the Democratic Party between I don't say this in the pejorative way that I was doing, the traditional center-left establishment and the very energized and enthusiastic progressive left, which is different than the Democratic socialist, like Mondami, Bernie Sanders, AOC, these other candidates who are winning with that label around the country, and that Abdul El-Sayed is actively embracing. Yeah, I really think that the way this dynamic is playing out, and watching whether it's Graham Plattner's meltdown in Maine or now the one-on-one battle between El-Sayed and Stevens in Michigan, that it appears to me, as an outsider to the Democratic Party, that the Abdul supporters are much more likely to stay away from the race in November, not ever consolidate behind Haley Stevens if she wins the primary. If she wins the primary, it's going to be because of blunt force trauma that's inflicted on El-Sayed from all these outside sources, AIPAC and Schumer-aligned PACs and whatnot. They've already spent $40 million, and the word on apparently is that they've got another $50 million coming. I mean, there's going to be $90 million right there. I mean, I think the Senate primary for the Democrats is likely to be 125 or 130 million. It's going to be even more costly than the Republican race for governor, and that kind of it might, money still matters. Having those resources matters, and it might be enough to get Haley Stevens across the finish line. But I bet as we start to see polls come out now that really take into account the fact that Mallory has dropped out of this race, that there's two candidates out there, that the Mallory support, that it was never ever the single digit support that was that chatter that came about after that faulty, flawed Steve Mitchell poll that kind of infected the view of the race by many pundits, observers, operatives, and press. Mallory was around 20% during the most of the year, might have fallen into the mid-teens, but no further than that. I think that her support is likely to, it's not going to go in mass to Haley Stevens. It's more likely that it skews toward Abdul El-Sayed at this point, or kind of breaks even, and it doesn't change the trajectory of the race. And right now, the trajectory of the race is El-Sayed is ahead, and he's likely to stay ahead. And I really think that he's as likely to win 60-40 against Haley Stevens as she is to eke out a 50% plus a couple of votes, maybe enough to avoid a recount victory. We'll see if I'm right in 3.5 weeks.
Yeah, just a couple final points, Jeff. I think, McMorrow ran a good campaign, and I think she left the race with a good reputation. She did not go negative and scorched earth on these other candidates. And I think she has a very bright future in Michigan politics. She was well liked across the board as she talked to voters out there. And apropos of one of your points, I'm very concerned about Democrats coming together after this primary. El-Sayed has already hedged a number of times about whether he would endorse Stevens should she be the nominee. That's not a good sign. Democrats need to keep their eye on the ball here, and the goal is to win retain the Senate seat for the Democrats. And it would be a terrible shame if this divisiveness and this selfishness cost Democrats this seat, and that cost us the majority of the United States Senate, because it could very well do that.
Yeah, because there's likely to be 2 Supreme Court nominations in the next 2 years, and a majority of Republicans in the U.S. Senate yields a completely different kind of outcome for those filling in confirming those nominees by Donald Trump or J.D. Vance, if the Grim Reaper finally comes calling for Trump. I will say I definitely think that McMurrow has a strong future, and not that Jocelyn Benson and her team are calling me saying, hey, who should I pick for my running mate? But if Mallory McMurrow isn't on the list and being talked about and considered, they're making a mistake. She should at least be part of that conversation and given a serious look by Benson, who's going to march to the nomination, despite the very spirited challenge from Genesee County Sheriff Chris Swanson, who continues to rack up endorsements from labor as they send a message about the attention they've gotten so far from Benson. We're seeing, a lot of ads, a lot of big spending in mid-Michigan in the race, the Democratic battle to take on freshman Republican Congressman Tom Barrett, MAGA Tom Barrett. Bridget Brink is the former ambassador to Ukraine, racking up all kinds of big endorsements, local endorsements, union endorsements, big political figure endorsements like Jim Blanchard and Jennifer Granholm this week. Matt Masdam is spending big money. There hasn't been a lot of, I guess, silence when it comes to public polling on this race. It feels to me, by watching this, looking at the candidates, watching what's on the airwaves, and seeing who's lining up where, that I'd rather be Bridget Brink than Masdam at this point. But either candidate seems to stack up very well against Tom Barrett. And I know I'm leaving out William Lawrence, the third candidate, but he's so woefully underfunded compared to these other folks. It's hard to see him ultimately being anything other than a difference maker to one of the other spending frontrunners.
Yeah, and Lawrence really hurt himself this week. He attacked Kamala Harris as a warmonger. I mean, that kind of internal attacks, don't serve anybody well. He lost a lot of credibility, I think, because of that. Yeah, I think I agree. I think Brink is the front runner. That explains why Masdam's allies have gone after her with some negative advertising using AI, falsely implying that she's a Trump supporter. And she's responded very vigorously, and she's got her own positive ads out there. In some ways, this three-way race is a more localized version of what's going on in the Senate race. It's not as nasty, and I hope it doesn't get nasty in the way that race at the Senate level has. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But I think Brink is the front runner, but she's not taking anything for granted. She's working very hard on the ground, on the air, very active social media, and a great grassroots effort. They gathered all their petitions, for example. I know because I was part of the effort, through volunteer efforts, which is a good sign in terms of somebody's ability to organize at the grassroots. And again, that's a very, very important district as well. All these seats in Michigan, whether it's Heisinga's, Barrett's, could determine who controls the U.S. House next year. So it's very important that Democrats get through these primaries in as good a shape as possible and then focus on the real enemy, which are the Republican incumbents.
More on A Republic, if you can keep it, after these messages.
When most of us think about polling, the focus is on those campaign polls telling us which candidates are winning. But the most important polls are for businesses, local governments, and nonprofits assessing the needs and wants of their customers or constituencies.
Those are polls that guide policies and lead to institutional success. Those polls have to get it right, which makes the choice of a public opinion research firm critical. Epic MRA has been trusted for more than 4 decades to get it right. Our clients have included school boards, statewide nonprofits, corporations, as well as the candidates and news media who rely on us during political campaigns. Whether it's just a couple of questions or a full in-depth survey, we're here and ready to help.
You can reach us at epicmra.com.
Hi, Ben Franklin here with a message from our finance department. They've put together a small, exclusive collection of really bitchin' merch for you. We've got our exclusive Trump's Favorite Podcast mug, perfect for those long days of reading through the latest administration indictments. We've got mugs for lovers of sanity, mugs for opponents of dumb fuckery, and finely tailored shirts for lovers of getting dressed. Just head over to the merch store on our website. This square thingy will take you there. Or click on the merch store button on arepublicpodcast.com. Support democracy. Support freedom. Wipe out dumb fuckery. Franklin, out.
Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve on Michigan's public policy landscape? Look no further than Michigan Information and Research Service Incorporated, or MERS. MERS is your go-to source for comprehensive, nonpartisan news and analysis on Michigan's government and public policy. But that's not all. A MERS subscription also gives you access to our powerful legislative monitoring and tracking tools. Stay on top of every bill, amendment, and vote with real-time updates, detailed reports, interactive committee transcripts, legislative analysis tools, and more. Whether you're a policymaker, lobbyist, or just a concerned citizen, MERS keeps you informed with daily updates, exclusive interviews, and detailed reports. Subscribe today and gain access to our extensive archives. Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay ahead with MERS. Visit MERS.news to learn more and subscribe. That's MIRS.news. Don't miss out on the insights that matter most.
Donald Trump's Department of Justice sent out 2 letters in the last few days portending a federal effort to meddle in Michigan elections. The first letter, sent to city clerks in Detroit, Lansing, and East Lansing, said the DOJ would be monitoring the August primary because of what it called irregularities in previous elections. State and local officials, led by Secretary Jocelyn Benson and Attorney General Dana Nessel, immediately labeled the substance of these letters total BS.
The second letter, sent to every state Secretary of State, promised criminal charges if the DOJ wasn't happy with how they ran their state's election. Joining the discussion is an expert on the DOJ and, in particular, civil and voting rights, University of Michigan law professor Sam Bagenstos. Sam has held multiple positions in the Justice Department, including serving as Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General, the second in charge of the Civil Rights Division, which also covers voting rights.
Well, welcome back, Sam. It's great to see you. We love your expertise. You're one of our more popular guests. I think I've told you that. Let's get right into it. This week we had these letters sent out by the Department of Justice to 3 cities in Michigan, making allegations about election irregularities, announcing they're going to send in federal monitors. You've got vast, long experience in the voting rights sphere, working for the Department of Justice. What's going on here? What is the Department of Justice up to?
Well, I think the big context here is that the Department of Justice in the second Trump administration has become not just an arm of the Republican Party and an arm of Donald Trump, but the enforcer and the generator of smoke, if not evidence, supporting his conspiracy theories around elections. And so, what we've seen in the execution of a search warrant in Fulton County, Georgia, and elsewhere in the country is this effort to make it look like there were problems with previous elections, and then to try to intimidate people about whether the elections to come are going to be able to be pulled off. And I think some of that is designed to suppress people's votes, but I think a lot of it really is designed just to kind of throw a lot of smoke up there and a lot of confusion so that they're preparing the ground for when they want to say later that an election has been stolen or there have been irregularities. That's really all that's going on here. I mean, it used to be that the Department of Justice, when they would send monitors or observers to elections, they would be doing so based on real concerns about voter suppression or voting irregularities. There's really no basis for that here. What this is all about is Michigan's a swing state. Maybe control of the Senate is going to turn on the senatorial election in Michigan. And they want to be prepared to make an argument that if the election goes against them, that there was something wrong with it. And I think the real tell here is, they decided to go to Detroit, to Lansing, and to East Lansing, probably other places as well, but Detroit, Lansing, and East Lansing, right? Those are places that are all very different in terms of election administration. The one thing they have in common is they're big Democratic jurisdictions. And so they're preparing to make a case that there was something funky about these big Democratic jurisdictions voting for Democrats in big numbers, which I fully expect will happen this fall.
Yeah, Sam, it seems like you're spot on with that analysis from my perspective, the way I see it, that they're looking at this August primary as a dress rehearsal to do the same thing in November on probably a larger scale. It's not lost on anybody that Lansing and East Lansing fall directly within the hottest congressional race over the last decade, anywhere in the country. The biggest spending congressional race year after year is Michigan 7th, which is anchored by Ingham County and Lansing and East Lansing. And so that's the kind of message they're sending. And it really looks like they're not giving up on November, but they recognize the way the winds are blowing. And what people weren't used to before 2020 was that Election Day doesn't stop the election, that the second campaign begins after Election Day, or once the polls close and the votes are counted, where they now start claiming rigged election fraud, they're stealing the votes, Republican jurisdictions, small across the country, or across the state and across the country, report their tallies early, create that red mirage. Just like we saw in California, Donald Trump is still talking about Spencer Pratt was cheated, and they got to open the DOJ investigation. They're setting this all up to not change or not impact November as much as they are to create and sow confusion and doubt, and maybe send competing delegations. That Tom Barrett loses, Bill Huizenga loses, and they go to Washington, and Mike Johnson is still speaker until he's not, and they try to seat these guys versus the actual winners of the races.
I mean, I think that is one of the things to be concerned about, that they're preparing the groundwork for that kind of a competing delegations argument. But it's very clear that what's going on right now is they're trying to start right now to make a case that there's something funky going on. I mean, you talk about Spencer Pratt in Los Angeles. Like, why would anybody be surprised that a Republican doesn't win or even come in second in an overwhelmingly Democratic jurisdiction like Los Angeles, California? But nonetheless, because of just an artifact of when the votes come in and how they're counted, here's Donald Trump saying that essentially Pratt was robbed, and you see this kind of thing down the line. So yes, I think what we have to worry about is these false narratives are going to be created. And unfortunately, and I say this, with real pain, because I started my career as a lawyer at the Department of Justice and Civil Rights Division. I served there as a career civil servant and as a political appointee under President Obama. And, that used to be a place where you could trust the professionalism. You could trust that they were going to call it like the facts were. And now, under the current acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche, and the head of the Civil Rights Division, Harmeet Dillon, who is a partisan warrior, all it's about is serving Donald Trump's interests in making it look like there's some problem with the elections, at least in Democratic jurisdictions.
Sam, there was a second set of letters sent this week, not just to Michigan, but to election officials nationwide, we understand it, that threatened these election officials with criminal prosecution if they knowingly allowed non-citizens to vote. Is this of a piece with what you've been describing, this effort to suppress the vote and raise doubts?
Exactly. And I think this really is trying to really encourage racial profiling at the polls to say to poll workers and election officials, you better be afraid if you allow somebody to vote who turns out to be a non-citizen. And what's that going to do? That's going to lead them to ask a lot more questions of people who they might believe, based on stereotypes or whatever, to potentially not be citizens. And that will necessarily impose barriers on voting for particular groups of people, particularly Latinos, but folks who are understood by some people to potentially be non-citizens, forcing them to prove their citizenship when they don't have to, when they're already on the rolls, that sort of thing. Yes, I mean, it's all of the piece.
Our listeners should know that that kind of profiling and challenges based on that kind of profiling are illegal in Michigan, but that doesn't mean we won't have people in the polling places, perhaps election inspectors themselves, doing that. And just the fear of that could suppress the vote. People would say, I don't want to be questioned about my citizenship, even though I'm an American citizen, whatever. So I'm just not going to vote.
And that's the goal, I think.
I agree completely with your assessment of Todd Blanche. And, I have made the claim, and I'll make it again in general, and I'm not a lawyer. So, but I disagree with your characterization of Harmeet Dillon as a enthusiastic partisan, or however you put it. She's a batshit lunatic enthusiastic partisan. I mean, there's not a semblance of sanity with some of the claims that she's made and the complete utter delusional lies that she's been pushing since 2020, and now has this soapbox, not just a soapbox, but one that comes with tremendous enforcement capabilities to attack our system in free and fair elections with this delusional nuttery of 2020 election being stolen. We've heard it for so long, we've just kind of gotten used to it. We fail to, I think, realize the threat that this causes to the trust in our system and the acceptance of the outcome by regular people voters. And it's with deliberate vigor by people like Harmeet Dillon and Todd Blanche.
That's absolutely right. And, look, I mean, we were all in Michigan back in 2020 and engaged in the electoral process in various ways. All of these allegations that there was some problem with the vote in 2020 were exhaustively investigated. They were investigated, way more than any other potential election, election irregularities in history have been investigated. And over and over and over again, independent investigators and courts, including judges appointed by Donald Trump himself, have said there was no evidence of any problems, right? I mean, if there is an allegation of election irregularity that has been more disproved than the 2020 allegations, I can't imagine what it is. But the fact that so many in the Republican Party have repeated the lie, and they repeat it and they repeat it. I mean, that has an effect. That has led a number of people who, just ordinary voters who are Republicans, who look to their leaders, who they presume know more about how elections work than they do. They're saying it over and over. I guess there must be something true to that. And so you see that in the polling numbers, where there's an increasing number of people on the Republican side who believe that the 2020 election was stolen. And I think that's incredibly corrosive of our democracy. Absolutely. And, and I think that that's, part of the goal. Part of the goal, and it's to rile up the troops, but also to call into question the legitimacy of any election in which Democrats win, to make it to create space for the extraordinary efforts that the Trump administration actually might be using to try to override election results.
Sam, I think it would be great to hear how this system is supposed to work inside the offices, on whatever floor the Civil Rights Division is on, and, voting rights is on in the Department of Justice. How has it historically operated, these decisions being made, the discussions being had, who's involved in them, versus what we're seeing now. Can you shed any light on that from your own experience?
Number one, the most important goal for the Department of Justice for years and years was to maintain its credibility as an authoritative speaker of the truth. That doesn't mean, they won all their cases. That doesn't mean everything, that they did was perfect. But what they wanted to do, particularly in cases involving elections, is create a series of processes to ensure that the political appointees who run the Department of Justice were not using the great power of the Department of Justice to put a thumb on the scale of elections. And so, that led to a bunch of policies like you're not going to announce or begin investigations within a certain period before an election if they might affect the election, that you're going to rely very heavily on career civil servants to make decisions and to make decisions according to processes that have been set forth in advance in the Department of Justice manual and elsewhere, so that we know that this isn't just sort of some political appointee saying, it would really help my party if we were to do this today. And so they're making an ad hoc decision. And it meant there were very high standards of evidence before the department would open an investigation, would reveal an investigation to the public, and would act on the investigation. And certainly we would do whatever we could to avoid actions that might chill or intimidate people in legitimately carrying out their election duties. So what we've talked about today is a violation of all of those sorts of things, right? I mean, so we have this very public announcement of irregularities in the 2024 elections, supposedly in these three cities, Lansing, East Lansing, and Detroit, on the basis of basically no evidence. And, the supposed irregularities are minor at best. The announcement that we're going to send monitors in, we have the highest level political appointees within the department, from the acting attorney general to the assistant attorney general on down, clearly deeply involved in the decision about what targets to pick on this sort of stuff, acting with an effort to affect the election as opposed to an effort to allow the election to proceed without interference. It's disregarding all of the important norms and people disparage norms, and I get it. Obviously, what we want is for people to follow the law, but it's important. We give the Department of Justice very strong powers so that they can prosecute crimes, so that they can protect our democracy. When those powers are misused, they can subvert democracy. And they can entrench the power of the people who are already sitting in those offices in D.C. and make it harder for folks to vote them out. And unfortunately, that's exactly what this administration seems to be trying to do in its actions around elections.
Speaking of abuse of power, Sam, there's another set of lawsuits I wanted to touch on, and that's these lawsuits the DOJ has launched to try to obtain full unredacted copies of voter files. Thankfully, they're 0 for 11 in the courts, even though in the Sixth Circuit, and you may not know this, they asked for rehearing in the last couple of days in terms of trying to get that court to validate what they're trying to do here in Michigan. Is it getting too late for anything to come of this, or are they trying to set up some way they can get to the United States Supreme Court and it can intervene and somehow order these voter files produced before the election?
Well, I mean, I think they clearly are trying to get to the U.S. Supreme Court on this question. There's no doubt about that. And, often a rehearing petition in the Court of Appeals is the stop right before going to the Supreme Court. I'll note that, that's not the only rehearing petition the Department of Justice has filed this week. They're also filing a rehearing petition in the Supreme Court on the birthright citizenship case, which they're going to lose. Which they've already, they already lost the case and they're going to lose that rehearing petition. Clearly, they can't take a loss. But on this matter, I think they are trying to get to the Supreme Court if they don't prevail in the Sixth Circuit.
Sam, you and I are lawyers. We've been trained. And you clerked for the United States Supreme Court for Ruth Ginsburg, you're a professor, you've served in the government. We're all steeped as lawyers in this culture and in respect for the United States Supreme Court. But there's increasing talk that something's got to change. The court needs to be expanded. Maybe Congress should restrict its jurisdiction. Our listeners probably don't know that Congress can dramatically change the jurisdiction of the United States Supreme Court. If I can kind of ask, I don't want to ask your personal opinion. I won't put you on the spot. But are you hearing that same talk in the professional and scholarly circles that you inhabit?
Absolutely. I mean, this has become not just talk, but, increasingly a loud din, almost a roar of conversation about what are we going to do? This is a Supreme Court that has gone in a very hard right direction and really a very partisan direction. It's violating its own procedures to make so many of these very consequential decisions on the so-called shadow docket without full opinions. And often those are cases where you see justices like Justice Jackson particularly, but also Justice Sotomayor and Justice Kagan arguing with really powerful logic and argument that the court does not need to be intervening, should not be intervening, and is really reaching out to give wins to the Trump administration to enable the destruction of various parts of the executive branch that probably aren't authorized by law, but in any event, lower courts that have considered the question have said, let's at least put this on hold. And the Supreme Court has jumped in to say, no, go right ahead. The Supreme Court has jumped in to say, let's let this a really aggressive mid-decade gerrymandering go ahead. This is a very partisan pattern of decisions. And so I think a lot of people are now saying, for a long time, people were like, no, we really can't touch the Supreme Court. As you say, Mark, in the Constitution, it's actually very clear that Congress has very substantial power of the Supreme Court. There's nothing in the Constitution that says how big the Supreme Court can be. And in fact, the size of the Supreme Court has varied through the years. Congresses have through the years adjusted the size of the Supreme Court, not just to meet changes in population or changes in the organizations of the lower courts, but also because of the way that the court has been acting and differences in the composition of the court. And so, we saw that, for example, during Reconstruction, when the Reconstruction Congress, acted to deny Andrew Johnson appointments to the court, basically, because they knew that he was really opposed to the principles of Reconstruction. But we also have seen other things through the years. I mean, so when does the court sit? Well, we've seen Congress cancel entire Supreme Court terms. What are the responsibilities? And the Reconstruction Congress did that as well. So did the Congress in the big fights between Adams and Jefferson in the early parts of the Republic. What are the responsibilities of justices, right? So does it have to be that they all sit as however many justices they are and they all hear the cases together? What do they have other responsibilities? The justices used to have to ride circuits, so they used to have to hear cases around the country in addition to sitting together in D.C. to hear appeals. And, a new court could do any of these things. It could expand, a new Congress could do any of these things. It could expand the court. It could alter the jurisdiction of the court up to and including, canceling or postponing terms. But it could also say, for example, that no appeal involving X kind of issue could be heard by the Supreme Court. There have been a number of bills that, the Article 3 of the Constitution does seem to give Congress very broad power over the appellate jurisdiction of the court. It could say to every justice of the court, you have to go ride circuit. But, I think one of the things that folks are really focusing on now is the need for expansion of the court. Because it is, and some of that is just technocratic, right? We've been stuck at 9 justices for a long time. The country's grown. There are a lot more circuits now than there used to be. Right. So if there are 13 circuits overall, so you could easily expand to 13 just based on that. Mm-hmm. If you look in my lifetime, so I'm 56 years old, Democrats and Republicans have been president about equal percentages of the time. And yet, overwhelmingly, it's Republican appointees on the court. And, that's because of strategic timing about retirements, as well as what Mitch McConnell did, denying Barack Obama the opportunity to replace Antonin Scalia and then rushing through Amy Coney Barrett when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. And so, I think a lot of people say that actually in some ways is the original sin that needs to be rectified here. And one way to rectify that might be to expand the court. And so I think you're hearing increasing discussion of stuff like that in Democratic Party circles. 5-10 years ago, you didn't hear that so much, but you're hearing that much more. I mean, even relatively moderate people within the Democratic Party, like Pete Buttigieg, has made some very aggressive statements about court reform and court expansion. Because, I mean, the other thing is, we have a court right now that has taken a very strong position in favor of executive power. And yet somehow, when President Biden tried to use his executive power to do a variety of things, whether it's respond to the pandemic, a once in a generation pandemic, really once in 100 years pandemic, respond to the pandemic, forgive student loans, whatever. You can agree or disagree with those policies, but that's not the court's responsibility. And yet the court stymied him. The people who should be judging President Biden and any president on their policies are the voters, not the courts. And yet this court, this very pro-executive court, said, no executive power to respond to the climate crisis, to respond to COVID, to respond to the student loan crisis. And I think people are seeing, this is just really skewed, that this is a very pro-executive power court when Donald Trump is exercising powers nobody ever thought an executive had. But, when President Biden makes some arguable calls in really tough times, well, yeah, sorry, you can't do that. And so I think that's just made the conversation, everybody understands that if there is a Democratic Party trifecta, coming up after the 2028 election, that they're going to face a hostile court. And that's something that people have to have a plan to deal with.
Yeah, I was a 50-year Republican, and I firmly believe it's time to expand the court. I said last week on this podcast, 13 circuits, 13 justices. It makes, sense. But I also think we ought to be having a discussion about expanding the number of members of the U.S. House, which was artificial. It wasn't capped until it was. In the early 20th century, they capped it at 435, and now we're into this reapportioning how many of the 435 are allocated where. And, the original language of the Constitution capped the House district sizes at 30,000 residents. We would have 11,000 plus members of Congress. I'm not saying we should do that, but as we're getting now, where the average intent of the House and members being close to the constituents that they serve, we ought to be looking at doubling, tripling the number of representatives. I know that probably sounds like, oh my God, to most people. That's all we need is more members of Congress. But we ought to be looking at sensible reforms that the country has changed. The population has grown. We have this cap that was placed statutorily, more than 100 years ago. It can be undone statutorily as well.
I think that's right. And there's an increasing discussion about congressional reform to go along with the discussion about judicial reform. Increasing the size of the House is something that, I hear people talking about as well, for all the reasons you say. I mean, and, and I think there are other things that people are talking about, why do we have gerrymandering the way we have it in this country? Mm-hmm. Well, because we have a federal law that requires single member districts, and we have the states basically making the decision about how they're going to draw up the districts. You could respond by having a federal law that has multi-member districts with, proportional representation. You could have a federal law that requires states to have independent redistricting commissions like we have in Michigan. There are a variety of things that you could do, going along with increasing the size of the House, which I do think would make members of the House at least more closely connected to their voters and maybe make the role of money a little less important. The bigger these districts get, the harder it is to communicate with everybody in the district, and the more money becomes important. So, I think there's a whole lot that needs to happen. I think there needs to be reform within Congress as well. A lot of people talk about filibuster reform in the Senate, but there are a whole lot of other things that might need to happen. I think, one of the things about this moment in American politics is so much has been broken that it does kind of lead to us saying, well, we're going to have to rebuild something. Maybe we shouldn't rebuild it exactly the way it was if it would so well. May have worked well 100 years ago, but wasn't working 20, 30 years ago. Now that all that stuff's been torn down, maybe we can think a little bit more about what's the kind of government we want.
With that, Professor Sam Bagenstos, good friend, thank you so much. Great information as always. Incredible analysis, thoughtful analysis, as always, and very, very insightful. Sam, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much. I always enjoy being on your program, and this is a great conversation.
That's our time for this week. Our great thanks to Sam Bagenstos for his insights into Trump's efforts to win in 2026 through intimidation and government muscle.
And it's 2 for 1 when you subscribe to our YouTube channel. You get the full video experience of this podcast, plus the YouTube exclusive weekly report on the Trump crime and corruption cabal, greed, grifts, and grabs.
If the Republic is still standing, you know this, Mark and I will be back next week. Thank you for your attention to this matter.
A Republic, if you can keep it, is a presentation of Michigan citizens for a better tomorrow.